Hi, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm here with my co-host John Andrews, and my name is David Harvey. This is a podcast of two friends from two different countries, meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads us to talking about two texts, and often many more. This season we're taking a long, slow journey through the book of Acts to explore how the first Christians encountered the disruptive presence of the Holy Spirit.
Well, David, it feels like something momentous is happening today. We're into a new chapter. Come on.
The end of Paul's speech happened.
Yeah. Probably some of our listeners thinking, when are they going to get out of Paul's speech? But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. We certainly enjoyed it in the conversation of Paul's speech. But we have crossed a line into chapter 21 of Acts. And actually, not only are we crossing a line into 21, it feels like we're starting to cross lots of borders as well. Yes. And it feels like there's a serious bit of travel happening here.
I was thinking about that Lucan pattern of, quite intense speech or event or happening, and then a series of travel data that sort of comes in at that point. And so we make it to chapter 21 today, don't we?
Come on. And I actually like the idea that Luke gives us this sort of detail. I do, there's something just very normal about this, that you're getting a sense of the journeys these people are making, the cost involved, and the fact that, the distances involved means, they would have spent a lot of time on a boat. And therefore, there's a whole bunch of detail we don't actually know about in terms of what they did while on that boat or what they did while walking to such and such a place. So it is, I love the normalization of that. But of course, with Dr. Luke, all of those little details are saying something to us as well. So worth leaning into and not skipping over.
I sometimes wonder what it would have been like to travel by boat in those eras. I have a tendency, I think, to sort of anachronistically imagine, you and me getting on a boat as we might do, a little ferry to cross, to cross the various channels that are around the places that we live in, or to compare it to how, I was laughing. I was traveling a couple of weeks ago, and I was thinking to myself that you jump on a plane in the northern part of the Americas, and a few hours later, I'm getting off in Atlanta, and then I'm jumping on another plane and moving up to the Northeast, and it struck me. I thought, wow, we just do this all the while, sipping a Coca-Cola and
Indeed.
And watching a movie. And
Indeed.
And I wonder sometimes about how would the early Christians, people like Paul's group, what sort of affordability would they have had?
Indeed.
In terms of almost how they traveled on these boats. And even if you were very wealthy, how nice was the boat travel anyway?
Yeah.
Not to, we will find this out in Acts, not to mention all of the danger of this as a mode of travel.
Indeed.
It does seem that often walking was preferred, if you could, to going on a boat. So I don't know, as we come to read this, do you think it's worth sort of holding those things in mind?
I think absolutely. As someone who has had the privilege of traveling all over the planet, and yet I do struggle a little bit sometimes with motion sickness. So I've disgraced myself a couple of times on an airplane because of very, very bad turbulence. But the thought of getting on a boat like this, I'm just thinking, okay, hand me the sick bag now, and just leave me with that, or just leave me to stand on the side and empty the contents of my breakfast overboard. So it is tough travel, and it wouldn't have been the most comfortable dynamic. But I think one of the things that I would be fairly certain of is that they use this committed time. I would imagine while they're traveling on these boats, they're either taking advantage of some level of rest or maybe preparation, maybe some writing going on there. Certainly conversations and teaching. I can't imagine Paul sort of just lying around doing nothing in the context of that. So I'm fairly certain that these journeys where they spend long periods on the Mediterranean, for example. And I think they would have committed that time and used it while traveling. So, but it does put a context to some of these incredible moments, the journey narrative around it and the journey motif. And of course, Luke does that with Jesus too. So we get a real sense in the middle of the Gospel of Luke of Jesus journeying from the north towards Jerusalem. And I know they're relatively short distances. Luke puts a lot of effort into that sort of from end of chapter 9 for the next 10 chapters or so. You've got this dynamic travel motif kicking off in his Gospel, and with it some of those beautiful parables and interactions are to do because of that traveling. So you've got a lovely mirror in both the book of Luke and the book of Acts around the traveling.
And so chapter 21, verse 1, we get a lot of traveling in a few verses. So shall I jump in and read this for us?
Go for it. That would be great. Let's set the context for our listeners, and then we'll see where we go.
So verse 1 begins like this. After we had torn ourselves away from them, we put out to sea and sailed straight to Kos. The next day we went to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. We found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, went on board and set sail. After sighting Cyprus and passing to the south of it, we sailed on to Syria. We landed at Tyre, where our ship was to unload its cargo. We sought out the disciples there and stayed with them 7 days. Through the Spirit, they urged Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. When it was time to leave, we left and continued on our way. All of them, including wives and children, accompanied us out of the city, and there on the beach we knelt to pray. After saying goodbye to each other, we went aboard the ship, and they returned home. We continued our voyage from Tyre and landed at Ptolemais, where we greeted the brothers and sisters and stayed with them for a day. Leaving the next day, we reached Caesarea and stayed at the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the 7. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. After we'd been there a number of days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Coming over to us, he took Paul's belt, tied his own hands and feet with it, and said, "The Holy Spirit says, in this way the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles." When we heard this, we and the people there pleaded with Paul not to go up to Jerusalem. And then Paul answered, "Why are you weeping and breaking my heart? I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." When he would not be dissuaded, we gave up and said, "The Lord's will be done." After this, we started on our way up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea accompanied us and brought us to the home of Manason, where we were to stay. He was a man from Cyprus and one of the early disciples.
Beautiful stuff. Beautiful. Lovely. And clearly in the context there, Paul is pushing out towards Jerusalem. That's the ultimate goal, which we'll probably get to in a few podcasts' time. Again, just fascinated by that lovely little introduction, giving us an idea of the travel. And it's worthwhile our listeners, I think, grabbing a map. If you've got maybe in a good study Bible or a good dictionary, there may be maps of what sometimes is referred to as Paul's missionary journeys. I've got one in front of me here, which is really helpful. And it seems to be, in terms of even the mode of transport, David, I know this is a bit sort of Bible nerdy, but the mode of transport, Paul seems to have shifted, because probably if you look at the map, he goes from Kos and then hopping down eventually to a place called Patara. And it's there he changes ship. So what seems to have happened is that early part of the journey, they're probably on what might be a sort of a coastal hopper boat, a sort of a boat that will stay close to the coast rather than endangering itself out in the sea. And so probably a smaller vessel in some ways. And then they change mode of transport probably at Patara. And from Patara, if you grabbed the map and looked at this, they sort of do a southeasterly diagonal line from Patara all the way across to Tyre. And And I love how to describe it. We sort of pass by or passed under, or with Cyprus on the left hand side, we pass by. So actually, if you look at the map, you can literally see they are skirting Cyprus to the south and landing straight at Tyre within that context. And again, to give our listeners a little bit of context on that, the journey from Patara through to Tyre would roughly be 400 miles or 644 kilometers in sort of modern, more modern measurements. So not an inconsequential journey there. And again, you think of the logistics and the money and the investment. What size was the group that Paul was traveling with? There's clearly a we going on there as well. So it does just put in context again. Here's a 400-mile or 644 kilometer journey across the Mediterranean just to make his way towards Jerusalem. These are not inconsequential ideas, and they put into context the sort of cost and energy and planning and demands that are on these groups of believers as they spread the gospel across the known world.
It's fascinating as well how the mode of travel reminds us that, as we said leading into this is not an easy journey, and they're having to work with the constraints of the ancient world, right? And I alluded to a flight I took just recently. I was down in Virginia, and I went to Virginia for the weekend, which is, if you look on the map, the move from the Rocky Mountains of Alberta to Virginia. And to make it easier, I went via Atlanta. So I flew well south and 3 days later came back again. And on my way back, the airline moved a flight, and I was complaining to a friend saying, "Oh, they moved my first flight, which meant I had an extra hour to wait in the airport in Atlanta." and I was thinking then about this passage here and how it looks like they're almost hitchhiking their way. My guess is they're paying their way, but they're having to go where there's trade routes. They're not able to charter a flight. It'd be the difference between us in the modern world. We're flying commercial airlines or just picking up a private plane. They're not private planing their way around. They're having to choose what routes exist, and you can see. And this is where I love, Luke, to me, is very evidently giving us eyewitness accounts. The level of detail is interesting. But you're noticing, even in this text, we had to stop there to unload cargo. The primary purpose of these routes is not to move Paul and his companions around. They're on, they're in the back of a wagon, for want of a better. And that's why I quite like. I think it's Willie Jennings who uses the term that they're hitchhiking their way around. I quite like that imagery.
Well, it's true, and it does put our sort of conversation into perspective. And of course, one of the glorious things that the early church is capitalizing on very, very quickly is and are the trading routes of the day. They're using the infrastructure that Rome has created. They're using the opportunities that are afforded to them. And of course, though this would have still been relatively slow travel, this would have been much quicker than on foot through the interior, across and then south. So this is saving huge amounts of time, but it's still very much, they are using what is afforded to them. And I think it's been one of the constant ideas through the book of Acts is that the church of Jesus Christ is being clever in simply using what is available to it in order to present the gospel. So I think that's a very powerful idea. But I think one of the things that I noticed, David, as I looked at it, was the continuous references on the journey to followers of Jesus. I don't know if you sort of spotted this or noticed this, but I thought it was absolutely gorgeous. So we've sort of talked about the infrastructure that these guys are using, that the Romans have established. But there's now also, along these trading routes, along these stops, there are Christian communities, which shows that not only has the church used the trading route just to travel, but they've used the trading route clearly as opportunities for mission as well, which I thought was just absolutely gorgeous. And Luke just keeps dropping this in. So let me sort of pick it up here. Verse 4, we sought out the disciples there and stayed with them 7 days. Then it goes on to say, verse 7, we continued our voyage from Tyre and landed at Ptolemais, where we were greeted by the brothers and sisters and stayed with them for a day. Verses 8 and 9, leaving the next day, we reached Caesarea and stayed at the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the 7. And he had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. Lovely little piece of information there. And then, of course, you've got verses 15 and 16. After this, we started on our way up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea accompanied us and brought us to the home of Manson, where we stayed for a day. He was a man from Cyprus and one of the early disciples. So there's 4 dynamic references to groups of believers or individuals on the trading route, sort of on the way. And it seems to me this that not only is Luke telling us, here's how we got around and here's some of the challenges we faced, but Luke is also saying these trading routes actually became natural missional arteries for the church. And the church used them, and it seems at virtually every stop-off point where there was a significant population, churches are getting planted, or at least followers of Jesus are gathering together and supporting each other. Is that a fair little observation there?
I think it's interesting even that what you're seeing on the coastal cities is what we're also seeing around the road networks of what you're saying there. That the churches that we encounter in Paul's letters are all along the various road commerce routes.
True.
And now what we're seeing is that apparently, I mean, this is an inference, but I think this is what you're suggesting as well, is that there's also a sea network. So wherever there's travel going on, disciples have been moving around. So we're following Paul, but I mean, there's this sense across, here we are 21 chapters into Acts. There is this sense that I mean, at some level, the trading patterns of the ancient world are defining where the disciples are growing. That seems to be, because we're seeing this at sea, what we've seen at land, aren't we?
Yeah.
There's a few times our listeners will recall we've got the map out. I realize maybe you're listening to a podcast, so you can't see our map, obviously. But if you were to look in your own Bible map, you would see that journey on sea is matched similarly, months ago when we did the podcast and we were looking at Paul's land journeys, same thing. It's where people are moving. So to me, what's fascinating about that is that this is clearly a model, so that even when Paul is moving spaces that he hasn't spent much time, there's other evangelization projects going on of people moving in and about, and maybe just moving in and about their lives, right? Maybe these people are also traders of some sort, and it makes sense for them to be in those spaces. It's quite profound, actually, to watch the circumstantial nature of the development of the gospel, right? That I think, without trying to, over egg the pudding, as they might say, John, I want to almost ponder what that means for us, as Christians, and in terms of how we think about missiology, the pursuit of the mission of the church. That so often, I think what we do is we say, this is how to plant a church, start a missional project. And it involves almost, and I want to say this very gently, because this could be, misconstrued, but almost a kind of colonial approach, right? That we'll come and we'll reshape things doing it our way, right? And And yet what you seem to see in Acts is the reshaping is the work of the Spirit.
Yeah.
They're just going about their dailiness. And so they don't arrive in a trade town and turn the trade town into a church town. They, in the trade town, live out the message of Jesus so that Jesus becomes, present to them in tangible ways. I'm maybe not articulating that well, John, but do you hear what I'm sort of wrestling with? There's
Totally.
less of this is not how, let me say it like this. This is what I think I'm trying to say. This is not the advance of a war front, right? Which is so often the language we use about kind of Christian evangelization and mission, that they're kind of moving in and pushing out. It's they're actually living in the culture and context, probably just going about their day-to-day jobs, doing the work of Jesus, which I think if we can draw that into the 21st century, I think it can be quite beautiful, actually, to think about what does it look like to be disciples, in the towns and the cities and the villages that we live in.
Yes. No, completely. And I would really lean into that. And I think if you're looking at the patterns of, say, the Paul and Barnabas first trip and then Paul's second trip, and we're sort of at the tail end of Paul's third trip, there's a constant learning, there's a constant adaptation, and there's a sense in which there feels there's some element of strategy in terms of hitting big coastal cities so that maybe they can become the staging posts into the regions. But there's also this lovely sense that of adaptation, where wherever they meet, wherever they engage, where they drop off, that they are seeking to bring something of the power of the kingdom to that world. And then let the kingdom, back to a gorgeous parable of Jesus, let the yeast of the kingdom infiltrate the dough. Let it just work in that context. Let it work in that moment. And I think that's why I love, as we've gone on this journey, even in chapter 21, I love the fact that Luke is mentioning names of towns, names of cities, names of places, because he's showing us that the church is infiltrating. It is just impacting and touching these communities, and whether they are relatively small, because you've got sort of vague stuff like sought out disciples, so we don't know how many that is in Tyre, and then you've got sort of Philip the evangelist's house with his 4 daughters. We don't know how big or extensive that community is. And then you've got, Manson, a single person, at least he's referenced as a single disciple. So you've got, again, even there, you've got the diversity and the dynamic, and it's all celebrated. It's not like, well, let's not talk about, Manson because it's only him, and that's not really significant. They're putting him in terms of connectedness and influence and importance as far as Paul is concerned. They're putting him on the same platform as Philip the evangelist, as the groups of disciples in Tyre. So there's a celebration of the Christian community, however large, whatever its constitution, and wherever it is. And I love that. I absolutely love this idea that there is, by implication, if not explicitly, there is implied dynamic diversity in each of these communities. And even the apparent size of the communities is being celebrated and highlighted, and not in any way marginalized because one is big and big is good, or because one is small and small is not so good. Wherever there is a presence of ecclesia, whatever that looks like, it is celebrated. And I think that shows something of the dynamic success of the gospel in the first century world, that just wherever they go, they are seeking to bring something of a planted community into those areas, whatever that planted community looks like, and then let that planted community function dynamically in its setting, with both, a cultural sensitivity, but also the opportunity that some of that positioning might afford it.
one of the pieces that I really loved when I was reading Willie Jennings' commentary on this is he talks about in this whole journey that you're talking about here, this growth of all this stuff that's happening. He talks about how they're following in one set predetermined routes, right? So things are happening, and there's an incidental nature to some of it, almost like, well, this is happening here. Why is there disciples in Caesarea? Well, that's where Philip ended up, almost. That sort of question. And like you say, there's not this modernist, that's good because it's big, and that's not so good for it's small. But part of the reason that we value those things, part of the reason that we think a bigger gathering of Christians is better than a smaller gathering of Christians is very subtly rooted in the notion that we are actually in control of these things, right? So if a church has a bigger gathering, that must be a better church than a smaller gathering. And then by implication, I think because of some of our hero complexes in the modern world, by implication, the bigger church probably has a better leader, right? There's probably a better person leading the big church than leading the small church. There's none of that here in Acts. That question's never raised, because in the same way that they're traveling along a trade route because that's what they have to do, there's actually another level of out of controlness going on in this passage, which I think we'll come to in future episodes, that they're not actually in control at all. Like, the Spirit is driving this story. The Spirit is what's drawing Paul. So even when people are beginning to even try and control Paul, it's not happening. So there's this gorgeous double level of out of controlness in Paul. that I think about his language in others of his letters. I am a slave of Christ, right? We've talked before about that pretty bold language. But he goes where the trade routes allow him to go, but he ultimately goes where the Spirit allows him to go. So even if Paul had a private jet and could fly anywhere he wants in the world, he's still going to Jerusalem, right? He's still going to go that way. And I think subtly in what you're saying, there's a gorgeousness of, once you submit to the Spirit, a small gathering of a man and his daughters versus another group of disciples with wives and children is all just the work of the Spirit. And it's the gospel, and it's beautiful, and it doesn't need to be judged by, forgive me if this is too strong, but by our modernist obsession with numbers equaling better. And I don't know if, I just feel that in this text, that it's worth naming, if that makes sense.
Completely. And I would add just one little thing to that, which I think adds even more weight to your beautiful summary. I think in each case, it's clear that Paul and the team seek these people out. So there's a sense in which, even from Paul's point of view, whether they're large or small communities, it's not like he's going, well, there's only a few of them, I'll not bother.
Yes.
But actually, Paul is seeking them out. And you do get the implication, or you get implied that it's not like they're sort of accidentally bumping into these four settings, but they're seeking them out. They have, explicitly in verse 4, it says, we sought out the disciples. Actually, they're entire, the implications. Instead, with them 7 days, so, you've got that lovely sort of idea of being greeted, where they greeted brothers and sisters instead with them. And then we reached Caesarea and went to the house of Philip. And then they go to the home of Manson. So they're seeking out these communities. They're not just going, well, we've got a day to kill. What do you want to do? One of their first priorities, and this is a repeated pattern all the way through the book of Acts, is that they find out Christian communities and seek to encourage them and be encouraged by them. And again, that is inherent value. That's not value because of size or value because of particular influence. That's value inherent in itself. That the Christian community gathered together is inherently valuable, whether that is a Christian community of 1,000 people or a Christian community of 10 people or a community gathered around a dinner table in someone's home. It is of inherent value. And the reason we're seeing that inherent value is that Paul, Luke, and the team, when they get an opportunity to get off a boat, they find disciples. They actually make the effort to go and engage. And I think that's a word to our modern society, where in many cases, gathering, finding each other, being with each other has become for so many an optional extra to fit in with our leisure activities and all the other things that we do. And please don't hear that as a judgment. It's just an observation. But here's Paul and Luke getting off boats going, right, where are the Christians? Let's find them, whoever they are, wherever they are, however big, however small, let's find them, because there is inherent value in the gathered ecclesia and that we could both invest into and receive from.
I love that. And even notionally, like your timing of telling this, as I've said already, so I'll bring it up again, but, just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Virginia, and I've never been to Virginia before. And I flew in for a friend's ordination service, and I flew in the Friday morning, and I left Monday morning. And on the Friday night, we gathered with some people from my friend's church around a fire pit on a nice fall evening, and ate some snacks and just talked about the church. We gathered around the table on the Sunday and took communion. We spent some time worshiping with those people, and it's interesting that as you leave, hugs are shared of people that you've only met days before. What was the point in common between this Scotsman that lives in Calgary and these people in Virginia? What was the point in common was we were people of Jesus, right? Yes. And therefore we're telling stories, even though in the back of our minds is this knowledge. It's not impossible that some of us will never see each other again. Right? It's not impossible that these few days that we're together is the only time we'll be together. And like, without laying it on too thick, John, I mean, that's one of the gorgeous things about the church, that these connections that are only made because of the Spirit. They're only made because of Jesus. Right? Otherwise, what's the point in getting to know somebody for 2 days? But in Christ, all of these things make sense. It makes total sense to turn up in Tyre and be like, right, let's go find the Christians. And I think we, as the church, probably in the modern West, and I don't want to turn this into there's no guilt intended in this. We could probably do with a few less hotels and restaurants and a few more family meals and sleeping in people's spare rooms and things like that, because there's something profound in the only thing that holds us together being just our love of Jesus and belief that there is one church that we're all part of. So that's it for this episode. We know that there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you liked this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all of our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, visit twotexts.com. But that is all for now. So until next time, from John and I, goodbye.